Just while we're getting microphones for people that have got questions, I might kick things off, Premier, with a tough one to begin with. You talked about education and the importance of education and the challenges that this state has, and I think everyone recognises that there are some unique challenges here. You said that money doesn't solve everything, and you made reference to Gonski, but at the end of the day, money does help, and there's obviously a debate going on at COAG level around ongoing funding with Gonski. What happens if the money doesn't come?
Well, we won't accept that for a start, and I am at pains as my minister to point to what are record levels of investment in education and training. It's a cornerstone of our government's agenda. It's critical not only for each individual student but for our state's economy and social progress, to lift productivity and for Tasmania to be a more prosperous community. So we will continue to invest record levels. We are, as I say, delivering the full Gonski at a state level. Our current estimates reveal a reduction in funding which we are resisting. We'll work very closely and cooperatively with our federal colleagues, but at any opportunity we'll fight for our fair share, but we can do so more strongly, I would suggest, across or against the backdrop of a record level of investment in education and training. That's starting to deliver results. That's being targeted to areas of the greatest need and is seeing an improvement. And as I say, importantly, tackling some of the cultural issues in education that have held our state back for too long. It's politically a little tricky to propose something that would suggest we bring the starting age forward or extend the leaving age, and not everyone in the community agrees with it, and some with interests in the education sector are opposed to it. But as I've said and will continue to say, it's simply bringing us in line with what happens in other states. And when people in the state say to me, why might it be that your educational outcomes aren't as good as they should be, I don't think it's because of our teachers or our trainers or our investments in the infrastructure. It's because we've got our kids spending potentially 2 years less in their education than their interstate counterparts. So we'll certainly put our hand up for our fair share at a national level, but it's also my way to demonstrate that we're doing our fair share of the heavy lifting down here as well.
Question over here.
Premier, Michael Churchill from Value Advisor Associates. I'll step out here since I'm lurking behind a pole. Quick question on private sector participation in infrastructure in the state. Is there a time in the future where we will see invitations for private sector involvement in infrastructure investment?
Yeah, we're certainly a government that is pro-business industry and that includes investment, and we're always open to sensible and useful proposals to co-invest. I pointed to a couple of great examples in our irrigation networks. That's a collaboration between state, federal and private sector. We've taken a very bold and innovative approach to our public housing policy to build those additional homes for our most vulnerable by assigning the titles of properties, government-owned properties, to the not-for-profit, the community sector, so that they can leverage off those properties and build additional homes for vulnerable Tasmanians. Yes, it's a little bold and revolutionary, perhaps too much so for some, and our political opponents have said we're privatising public housing, but as I've often said, in my view, what's important, what matters, is what works. And if we can engage the private sector to build more homes, public housing homes for vulnerable Tasmanians, then that's the right outcome. So, of course, as a Liberal government, we'll always look very closely at any proposals to engage the private sector. We've got expressions of interest, processes out to support unsolicited bids, to engage developments in our natural areas that are sustainable and sensible, but which allow people to access our national parks and the World Heritage Area. We've got the private sector engaged in helping our forest industry find a way to export its products from facilities. So we've got form and more than happy to talk to the private sector about how we can deliver better outcomes for our state, particularly in collaboration.
The question up the back there.
Premier Ron Banks, I noticed that in the paper that we all read and believe in, last week the CEO at Macquarie Point suggested that Rome really wasn't built in a day. Does that mean that there's been a change of policy in respect to Macquarie Point, and perhaps did the expressions of interest program fail?
No, certainly not. And we've got live prospects of interest in that development. One of the critical things that needs to happen is the relocation of sewage infrastructure, which is inhibiting the value of that parcel, and we're working with the corporation. It's not a government entity per se, but obviously a partner, one established by governments past, but which has principal responsibility for developing the site. It's their job to get it into best possible shape to realise its full value and to secure appropriate development on that site. As I say, the expressions of interest process has brought forward a number of very exciting proposals. There's a broader conceptual proposition, the Eden project, that have a live interest in the site. We do need to manage through those issues relating to the logistics, and that includes working with TasWater to understand what the best way forward is. But it's not cheap either, and it's perhaps one of the most significant reasons why progress might be deferred longer than we would all like, but that is to deal with what could be a very expensive piece of work to relocate that water or sewage infrastructure. So I think it was really more, Ron, a resetting of expectations so that people can be confident that we are together, progressing things in a timely fashion, not rushing, because we don't want to get it wrong either, and the corporation has always been keen to point that out. But hopefully we'll see some progress on those fronts as soon as possible.
I think Stephen, you had a question.
Yes, thanks, Jason. Premier Stephen Martin from CEDA. Earlier this year, CEDA released some research giving some advice to the federal government about how they might balance their budget. If I look at what's happened in New South Wales, if I look at what happened with your government, if I look at what's happened in Victoria, state premiers and their governments seem to have the ability to do so. What advice would you give to your federal colleagues about being able to deliver services but at the same time rein in expenditure, and how might they learn from the experience in Tasmania?
I think the fundamentals of growing the economy and increasing revenues are critical, and it's been relatively modest, as I say, in Tasmania, our growth, but against or in the context of disciplined budget savings measures, some tough decisions, a lot of them unpopular, discipline in public sector wages growth, living within our means, directing the fruits of our labours into those areas of core service delivery, supporting Tasmanians, improving health and education, but also into areas where we can stimulate economic growth, our competitive strengths, our tourism industry, agriculture, building and construction, the areas where we are experiencing rapid growth, including expanding into markets abroad for our export industries, have been where we've targeted our effort and some public resources to return on that investment and again sustain a more sound budget position. So you don't have to increase taxes because, as I said, we haven't done that, so that's not the way to do it. But I think sensible budget measures, the rate of growth of public expenditure in Tasmania is less than some other jurisdictions, including our friends in the West, while the volatilities of the GST are always an ongoing challenge for us. That will continue to be the case. Getting our fair share of the GST is also an important principle of our federation, but also, needless to say, a very important part of Tasmania's budget sustainability.
Other
So
questions?
don't change it, that's what I'm saying.
Yes, over here.
Steve Walsh from Unions Tasmania. Premier, you've made a lot of mention about tourism in your address. You'd be aware that Fair Work Commission has delayed a decision on penalty rates. Is your government prepared to make a submission to the Fair Work Commission on the importance of penalty rates to Tasmanian workers?
Yeah, we don't support, lest anyone think we do, changes to penalty rates, and you've touched on a very important part of Tasmania's economy, that's that our visitor economy that sustains our tourism industry and other related sectors that are in a strong period of growth. So we've articulated very clearly to the federal government that we don't support a change to penalty rates, but that's, as you say, a matter for determination by the Commission.
Other questions? We've got time for a couple more. Yes?
Premier Stephen Spargo from CEDA. I was just interested with your comments about the ambition to extend the age of education to bring it perhaps closer to what might be occurring in other parts of Australia. How much of that program is also going to be tied to altering the syllabus so you get a better mix of vocational training from year 10 through year 12 or what it might be? Because I think in other parts of Australia there's also a recognition that there are still problems retaining kids, but if you change the mix and alter that, can obviously help in retaining kids in school.
Sure. And skills shortages are another one of the challenges that we're confronting here in Tasmania, particularly in those growth areas, so it remains an ongoing area of priority. I should say as well that in addition to requiring a student to complete their schooling and not leave before they turn 18, alternatively, if they find employment or undertake another equivalent form of training, then that's cool too, and now necessary. So that will engage students in learning-based activity in school, in a workplace, or in another training organisation. And the key really is, as you say, often to aligning our workforce or work employer needs with what we are producing. So we've got, in fact, we've implemented recently new strategies to identify those pressure points, areas of opportunity to make sure that we, as a state, are alongside enterprise and training organisations producing people with the right sorts of skills that they need that are relevant to entering a workplace, not just here in Tasmania but globally.
I might ask the last question, Premier. Slightly political one, but you made a reference in your speech to the need to be brave around policy and reform. At the last federal election, more people voted for minor parties than at any other election. Do you think that's an indication that the general populace has a problem with the major parties? Are they wanting the major parties to be braver than what they are? How do you read that, and how do you maintain that brave approach of striking out and debating policy and being reformist in the current environment?
I think you need to tell me, or perhaps it's best for others to judge, because I lead one of those major parties here in Tasmania. But yeah, look, it's an interesting election result, and it is obviously of interest to see people's voting patterns and the rise of minor parties. I'm a fundamental believer in democracy, and I'd adage that the people always get it right. So I'll focus on my job and let the rest of you make your decision in about 20 months' time.
Thank you. Well, we might end it there. Look, on behalf of CEDA, on behalf of Westpac Institutional Bank and everyone who's attended today, and it's been a fantastic turnout. I think, Stephen, you'll probably agree with me, it's been one of the largest audiences that we've had at a State of the Estate address here in Tasmania. On behalf of everyone, could I say Thank you, Mr Premier, for your keynote address today. Can you please give the Premier a round of applause?